Is Snow White just one big metaphor for using that illegal white powder? This is one of the most common theories when it comes to this classic story, and Disney movies in general, actually. There's long been an idea that all or most Disney movies are, on some level, hidden messages about drugs or alcohol. And honestly, it's hard to deny it sometimes. I mean, think of it. When you go back into the classic Disney movies during Walt's life, you can find something pretty unhinged or borderline psychedelic in basically every single one. A lot of people believe that the animators of these classic movies used LSD and other drugs to influence their creative decisions on classic movies like Fantasia, Dumbo, and Alice in Wonderland. Take the pink elephants on parade sequence in Dumbo, one of the most notorious and frightening sequences in any Disney movie. In the sequence, Dumbo unintentionally gets drunk after drinking a vat of water spiked with champagne. In an intense hallucination, he sees pink elephants singing, dancing, and playing musical instruments. It's actually a very terrifying trip. But if I'm being honest, the sequence doesn't necessarily feel like it reflects alcohol use. It feels more like it's leaning into something more mind-bending or psychedelic, like acid or LSD, which are exactly the kind of drugs people talk about when they mention this theory. So what does all this have to do with Snow White, Disney's very first feature-length movie? Well, there's a much clearer connection to drugs than just one sequence with a few trumpet-playing elephants, I can tell you that. Just in case you're not super aware of the slang terminology being used in the drug community, Snow White is often a name used to refer to the magical white powder. But before you go jumping to the conclusion that Walt was the head of some kind of mega Walter White-esque powder empire and producing propaganda for children, let's just clarify something here. Walt Disney did not invent Snow White. The Snow White story is a fairy tale told for generations, first scribbled in a book in 1812 by the brothers Grimm, who called it Schneewittchen, literally Snow White in German. So the story predates Disney as a company by over a century, and while the powder was already around by the early 1800s, it's hard to believe anyone was calling it Snow White at that time. So I'm pretty sure we can wipe that one off the list, and Disney can thank me for it. No, Disney didn't intentionally try to link Snow White to the magical white stuff. But while he didn't invent the Snow White story, he and his creative team definitely had a strong hand in fleshing it out into the long-lasting story it's become. It was, of course, Disney who created the names and personalities that would come to define each of the 7 dwarves in the cultural mind. And he obviously did a great job of that, since everyone on the planet can name the 7 dwarves without having to think too much. But if you really want to find some kind of connection between Snow White and the world of drugs, you don't have to look all that far, because as it turns out, the dwarves represent the kind of symptoms that you often see in people who have been using drugs. Now, the question is a little different, right? The question now is, did he intend to make the dwarves so similar to the symptoms of drug abuse? Well, depending on who you ask, Walt is either dead or cryogenically frozen, so either way, we're probably not going to get an answer in this lifetime. But if he didn't, he did a damn good job of doing it by accident. Now, the dwarves don't directly reflect the symptoms in a literal sense. For example, someone on that white powder isn't going to start sneezing with gale force level winds, but they do have more subtle connections, so let's start with Dopey. Of all the dwarves, Dopey is the most immature, a youthful, childlike guy whose defining trait is his clumsy, accident-prone goofiness. He can't speak, though he's apparently never tried, and he's basically just one big toddler. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and say that someone on powder is just one big baby, but one of the telltale signs of substance abuse is the inability to focus and a sudden, inexplicable clumsiness. It's why you often see people who are drunk or high struggling to stay upright. They fall over, they slur their words, you get the picture. And I mean, that's kind of Dopey's entire character in the 1937 movie. He's constantly just goofing off, making mistakes, but always having a great time. Someone who isn't having a great time is Sneezy. In the movie, Sneezy is described as having hay fever, but his allergies seem to be a heck of a lot stronger than a little bit of seasonal sneezing. He's usually seen having extreme gale force sneezes so strong they can blow people away. Now again, that's not a common symptom symptom of the white powder, although that would definitely be something to make a video about. However, sneezy could potentially represent another side of powder usage, which is the damage to the nose. It's no secret that long-term use can basically destroy the nose entirely, forcing people to get drastic surgery to rebuild the cartilage. I think it could be argued that if they were inspired by similar drugs, sneezy was intended to reflect this aspect of it, rather than any clear sneezing symptoms. But then, even if a powder user did get some sneezes, I'm pretty confident in guessing that they wouldn't be gale force strength. Of all the dwarves, Happy is probably the one that most people would want to spend time with. He's bright, cheerful, friendly, always giggling. He's just in a constant good mood, and that is the kind of thing that a lot of people use drugs for in the first place. It's pretty common that a lot of people turn to drugs or alcohol in search of something to pick them up. Maybe they're in a bad place or just need something to boost their mood, but often that's why they turn to these kind of drugs. And often with the magical white powder, that's the big telltale sign. One of the biggest symptoms of powder use is a strong increase of energy and a boosted mood that allows them to do whatever they want to do.
Dig with a shovel or a pick.
That can be dancing or singing or partying, basically all of the stuff that Happy loves to do in the movie. That's exactly what people in real life would do too. I think Happy is the most clear of all the dwarves, the closest one to the real-life symptom. We all know people who have a drink and then feel they can dance for 700 years, and professionals say that powder use has a similar effect. It really amplifies whatever mood you're in. Now, if you're a romantic type, then you probably connect a lot with Bashful, the sweet-natured dwarf who's extremely shy. He has a shameless crush on Snow White, but he just can't bring himself to acknowledge her without blushing. In fact, pretty much every time you see him, he's blushing about something or another. Another symptom of powder abuse is paranoia. Now, let me be clear in saying that paranoia and bashfulness are not necessarily even close to one another, but both of them relate to being unnerved or uneasy around someone else, for better or worse. I think bashful fits that role. A lot of people who indulge in drugs or alcohol find that it doesn't make them more confident necessarily, but just amplifies a lot of the anxieties they already had. Some people find they become more shy when they get high than when they were sober, and someone like Bashful is a perfect example. He likes Snow White, clearly has a crush on her, but around her he gets shy and can't bring himself to act on it. We'll come back to that later, but I think Bashful is a good example of the psychological impact of drugs. On the physical side, we have Sleepy. It's not uncommon for people who have been using drugs to crash when the high dulls down. It's the hangover effect. The increased energy fades and the body craves an even bigger rest to reset. It needs to sleep. Well, that's Sleepy's entire life. He's constantly drowsy and never interested in what's going on around him because all he thinks about is when he gets to take a nap. His whole life is a perpetual hangover and he's just looking for the moment he gets to calm it. Which brings me to Grumpy, another dwarf who seems determined to just shut it all down. Grumpy's role in the 1937 movie is exactly what his name suggests. He's there to bring the mood down. He's there to be negative and miserable, to have a bad attitude, and he does it magnificently. He's the Eeyore of the dwarves, basically. In relation to drug use, Grumpy is basically the same as Happy. People have very different reactions to drugs. While some might end up in a state of joyful euphoria, others might consume the drugs and find themselves spiraling into a bad mood. That is Grumpy in a nutshell. I think he's designed to reflect the other side of the experience, the bad trip, and what that can do to the user psychologically. And what happens if your mood spirals worse and worse and worse, or you end up repeatedly using, hoping for a better outcome? You go to the doc. Yes, doc in it itself is not a symptom or a mood or any of those things, yet most people who end up in the cycle of drug use end up having to get medical treatment eventually. But I'm not going to focus on that. I'm focusing on Doc's personality itself. In the movie, Doc is the self-appointed leader of the dwarves. He's pompous, he's rambling, and he always seems distracted, even if he's trying to convince people he knows what he's talking about. Well, all of this is yet another trait common in drug users. Many people high in the magical white stuff have this incredible ability to speak for a long time with great confidence while saying absolutely nothing about a topic they're unfamiliar with. They start speaking with confidence only to gradually shift into 1 or 7 other topics without ever really being able to focus on one at a time. It's a symptom that professionals describe as a sudden overabundance of confidence, and it's most common in powder use. This, like happy, is the closest link to actual powder abuse symptoms. Every doctor highlights this unfounded confidence as being the most common symptom of powder use, and the movie seems to lean into that too. So, what does all of this mean in the context of the story? Well, there's just something interesting about the fact that Snow White literally drifts into the dwarves' lives and makes them all come to life. The metaphor kind of writes itself. The drug wakes up these symptoms. Happy is happier around her, Dopey dopier, Doc is more arrogant, you name it. Snow White just brings it out of them. Now, there's no reason to believe that Walt or his creative team ever indulged in extensive drug use to inspire their movies. In fact, all we know about Walt's substance abuse is that he loved his whiskey and his cigarettes, though the Walt Disney Company doesn't like to talk about that for some reason. But there are some interesting connections between the Snow White story and the symptoms and traits of drug use that are hard to ignore. So maybe there is something there, and maybe it is exactly like I said. Maybe Walt and his creative team created a story in which the presence of Snow White brings out these drug traits in the dwarves. Or maybe it's just a cartoon about a homeless woman who becomes besties with 7 slightly unhinged magical dwarves. I don't know, man. I just like cartoons.